And welcome back. We are in chapter 5 of Mark. Jesus again exorcises a demon who identifies him as Son of the Most High God. Chapter 5, verse 7. And again, Son of God is not necessarily a divine appellate. It's just a name for a really holy person, a very holy person, someone who follows the laws. It's not equating the Son of God with God in any sort of literal sense. Jesus then is approached by someone who is possessed by a demon called Legion, which actually is a Roman army unit of 5,000 to 7,000 men. And the demons beg to be allowed to go into a herd of pigs, which is nearby, so they go into 2,000 pigs, and they go down a bank into the sea. 2,000 is a very large number for a very large, for that time. A herd would be very large at that time. So that sometimes is said to be an example of marked exaggeration. The man wishes to follow Jesus, to go with Jesus after he has been exorcised, but Jesus says, "Go to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you." So this is an example of a time when Jesus does not tell someone to be silent, but tells him to spread the word, so to speak. Jesus heals a girl at the point of death, and then a woman who has a hemorrhage or bleeding can't get to Jesus and just tries to touch the hem of his clothes, which he does. And Jesus feels the power go out of him, but doesn't know who it is. And that raises a theological issue. Jesus is unaware of something happening, but he is aware of the power flowing out of him. Matthew removes that and does not say that he does not know how that happened. And later she is identified and she comes in fear and trembling. And that phrase will become important throughout the scriptural tradition and later, fear and trembling. Then there's a girl who has died, we are told, and Jesus says, no, she's just sleeping, but she probably has in fact died. And he brings her back to life, and he says, Talitha cum, which is Aramaic, which is the language that Jews at that time spoke in Israel. They did not speak Hebrew, they spoke Aramaic, which is very close to Hebrew. And Talitha cum means little girl, get up. And here he tells them, he strictly ordered them that no one should know about this. So the Messianic Secret again. In chapter 6, these miracles are called deeds of power, dunamis, more than miracles in the sense of wonders. They're acts of power. 6, the 12 are sent out on a mission. They're given authority over unclean spirits. So again, their mission is one of miraculous healing and exorcism. They cast out many demons and cured many who were sick. This actually also may relate to the experience of the early Christian church. So this may be actually a post-Jesus experience that is put back into the life of Jesus. In verse 30 and following, we have the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus began to teach the people many things, but very little of that is mentioned really anywhere in the Gospel of Mark. There's very little teaching on theology, ethics, behavior, spirituality. It really seems one miracle after another. In the Hebrew Scriptures, there is a precedent for a multiplication of food, a feeding of many people. In verse 47 and following, we have Jesus performing another miracle, a nature miracle, walking on water. And as he's walking by the disciples in their boat, they are afraid, but he says, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." But the Greek is literally ego eimi, I am. And that is a phrase that is used by the divine, is used by God in the Hebrew Scriptures. So perhaps this is a way that Jesus is saying, I am, using the language in the Hebrew Scriptures that refers to the divine, or the writers of Mark are using that language, ego eimi, I am. God was described as the great I am. In your English, it's probably translated, "It is I," which makes more sense in terms of Jesus talking to the disciples, but literally in the Greek, it is I am. Now in chapter 7, we have a discussion of the dietary practices. And again, this could be the experience of the post-Jesus Christian community in which they are trying to figure out if kosher laws, dietary laws, are going to be followed. And it makes sense to think that this is written back into the life of Jesus. There is a lot of controversy in the early church with people who want to maintain the dietary laws, the kosher laws. And here Jesus is saying that it really doesn't matter. It matters what comes out of you, not the food that goes into you. So it would be hard to imagine the Christian community really debating this if Jesus already in Mark had said, we don't need to follow those laws. So this again may be an example of the experience of the early Christian community being writ back into the life of Jesus. In chapter 8, we have the feeding of the 4,000, which may be just another variation of the other story, the feeding of the 5,000. And in verse 11, the Pharisees ask for a sign, and he says, a sign will not be given. However, if we look at Mark critically, it seems like almost all the gospel is itself signs and wonders, dunamis, miracles, nature miracles, exorcisms, healings. I think these could count as signs. I'm not sure what else they're asking, but in fact, the whole gospel seems to operate on this level of religion as if miracles are proof texts, or miracles are proofs of the divine. And then there are also proof texts from the Hebrew Scriptures. So it does seem that in Mark we're sort of having a religion based upon signs. So I take this as somewhat ironic, but you may read it as you wish. Chapter 8 is also very important because Peter identifies Jesus as the Messiah. You are the Messiah, Peter says in verse 29. And then Jesus tells him strictly not to reveal that information. And part of that is because the theory we have been working with is that the Messiah is not going to be a military political leader who will bring glory and a change to the political landscape, and the nations will again flow to Israel. It's not going to be that kind of secular Messiah. This Messiah is going to suffer, and after 3 days rise again, we are told in verse 31. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. So the problem for Mark and early Christians is, how do we explain the image of the Messiah when Jesus was crucified as a criminal? How could someone like that be the Messiah? And that is part of what Mark is trying to show. And not only will the Messiah suffer, but the disciples and followers of Jesus will also suffer. For those who want to save their life will lose it, it is said, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. So, again, this maybe reflects the time where followers of Christ are experiencing persecution and they are being killed. So it's not just Jesus, it is, again, the experience of the church. But then it is said, truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God has come with power. So if there is an eschatological or end time coming back of Jesus in power, here is some evidence that they felt it would happen in their lifetime. Again, this makes sense for the experience of the early church. Chapter 9, verse 1. And then in chapter 9, verse 2, we have the story of the Transfiguration. another, you could say, miracle story where Jesus is transfigured, his clothes become whiter than any bleach could make them. And that is also a theme in apocalyptic literature in Judaism. That was not unknown. Well, the disciples could not cast out a demon, and we see Jesus respond with some humanity and emotion. You faithless generation, how much longer must I be among you? So that's a very human verse, very funny verse. It shows real human emotion on behalf of this religious figure. Verse 30, again, the Son of Man will be betrayed, and he will be killed and rise again in 3 days. And then the disciples were arguing who is going to be first and foremost in this new kingdom of God, this reign of God that the Messiah is going to bring in. And Jesus is the Messiah. So they want to know who's going to be his right-hand man, who is going to be important in this kingdom. And they still don't get it. That the kingdom of God is not this glorious secular political realm, but a realm in which the first will be last, and that the goal is that you should be a servant of others. So it's really ironic. The disciples are arguing who's going to be first, who's going to be most important, and that's totally not the kind of kingdom of God Jesus is talking about. In verse 43, hell is mentioned, and this is literally in Greek Gehenna, and this is I think different than Sheol, which is sort of just this universal place where everyone goes. Gehenna is for the punishment of the wicked, and it actually is related to and comes from the valley of Hinnom, a site that was used for pagan infanticide, so the killing of infants. And it was later defiled by Josiah. And this place, Gehenna, became a name for the place where the wicked would go after death. So this is more like, I guess you could say, a modern understanding of hell as a place of punishment. So Gehenna has a very specific meaning